Welcome everyone to Wednesday Night at the Lab. I'm Tom Zinnan. I work here at the UW-Madison Biotechnology Center. I also work for UW Extension and Cooperative Extension. And on behalf of those folks and our other co-organizers, Wisconsin Public Television, Wisconsin Public Radio, Wisconsin Alumni Association, and the UW-Madison Science Alliance, thanks again for coming to Wednesday Night at the Lab. We do this every Thursday night. Wednesday. No, I've never done that before. We do that every Wednesday night, 50 times a year. Tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Barry Hartup. He's with the Department of Surgical Sciences here in the School of Veterinary Medicine, and he's also with the International Crane Foundation. He was born in Iowa City in the great state of Iowa. And he went to high school in Roseville, Minnesota. And then he came to the University of Wisconsin-Madison to get an undergraduate degree in zoology. And he got his master's degree in the Nelson Institute. And then he got his Doctor of Veterinary Medicine here at UW-Madison. After a few years of practice, he went to Cornell to get a PhD. And then in the year 2000, he started in at the Crane Foundation up near Baraboo. Tonight, he's going to talk with us about the health of cranes, avian medicine, and conservation. Please join me in welcoming Barry Hartup to Wednesday Night at the Lab.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here speaking to you all tonight. The story, I guess, that I'm sort of weaving in throughout this presentation is one that took about 35 years or so to manifest. It sort of tells the journey of how the School of Veterinary Medicine and some of its staff have helped the world of avian conservation by sort of practicing veterinary medicine sort of outside the usual bounds and considering a species, working with a species that not everybody gets to work with very often. And what's very interesting about my situation right now with this sort of dual appointment, yes, I have standing here at the university, but I'm also the Director of Conservation Medicine at the International Crane Foundation. And I was thinking today, one of these days I'm going to have to get a custom-made hat that has both logos, and whenever I need the logo of choice, I can spin it forward. This really is sort of a collaboration between the university and one of our favorite non-governmental nonprofit organizations in South Central Wisconsin, the International Crane Foundation. And what I do is essentially, I am the doc for a unique sort of living museum of the world's 15 species of cranes in Baraboo. ICF is an organization that has been in existence since 1973. They're the only organization that I'm aware of in the world that exhibits all 15 of the species of cranes that are extant currently. What has always made this place so unique is the fact that it is so mission-driven on one taxa. And the reason is because cranes are one of the most endangered families of birds in the world. Of the 15, 11 are threatened or endangered with extinction. And so since its founding, ICF has always made use of resources in the wildlife health or avian health world. Here at the university, actually, there was sort of a precursor, I guess, or one consultant was, did any of you know Bernie Wentworth, formerly of the Department of Poultry Science? Bernie was an avian physiologist and a big helper to ICF in its early days, as well as the USGS National Wildlife Health Research Center, or the Health Center, which is on the south side of the Beltline, has been involved with ICF for some time. But really the sort of the clinical approach or the application of veterinary medicine to the health of cranes really began with the veterinary school's founding in 1983. So we are at that 35-year mark. And actually in the upper left of this picture is someone who I met in the summer of 1986 when I was doing my internship with the ICF after my zoology degree, was a veterinarian by the name of Paul Howard. And he was one of the original clinical faculty at the school. And he was helping this kind of wacko project with sandhill cranes being done up at the Nite National Wildlife Refuge northwest of here, where they were rearing these sandhill cranes with people wearing costumes so that the cranes didn't imprint on the people. And using that as a first run at an approach to take captive reared animals and successfully reintroduce them in the wild. So here he is doing a health check on the birds. And then throughout the 1990s, one of the veterinary school's first exotic animal faculty, Dr. Julie Langenberg, was also the consulting veterinarian for the Crane Foundation. And she was my mentor in veterinary school when I was a student there. And so lo and behold, I come back in 2000 and take her position as Julie moves on to our first, being our state's first wildlife veterinarian. Lucky for her, she got chronic wasting disease to deal with, and I didn't have to deal with that. So I sort of went off in my cool yellow phase there and have been with ICF since. But what we've really done to sort of move our program and our training forward is now we have multiple postgraduate trainees doing their residencies in zoological medicine in collaboration with the university and the Milwaukee County Zoo. And that's Dr. Jen Hausman, who's a new staff member at the Denver Zoo. She finished last year. So ever since my position with ICF, we have had a much more formal tie. So I remember back when I was an intern at ICF, I met people like Dick DeBilzig. I met contemporary staff members of his at the school. But that was always just sort of a fee-for-service type arrangement. We've got an issue, we're going to bring birds down for special care. But now we are sort of a preferred cooperative institution working with UW Veterinary Care for the betterment of the cranes, and then all of the programs that we can contribute to really worldwide. Of course, the base work that we do is the core work. Job number one is what I do as a zoological veterinarian. There is a captive flock of about 120 cranes up at the ICF in Baraboo. And we use the sort of best practices to make sure that we feed them a good diet. We keep them free of parasites. We use vaccinations and annual health exams in this very comprehensive sort of preventive medicine program. And we take great pride in setting a variety of records, it seems almost every other year, with being able to improve the longevity of a lot of the specimens that live at ICF. In fact, our oldest crane at ICF right now, he and I share a birth date. I'll let you guess how old I am. But this of course is a great way to get our residents and then also veterinary students really involved with our programs, because a lot of them are looking for sort of alternative experiences to add to their classic veterinary education. But we've also, I work in really sort of implementing a big biosecurity program at ICF as well. This is a map showing the 2017 outbreaks of highly pathogenic avian influenza throughout the world. It's been a very interesting process to have to deal with two emerging diseases since I started at ICF. One was West Nile virus. What kind of a threat would that have posed to cranes potentially? And now, what about avian influenza? And so we have established very tight biosecurity programs to make sure that our birds stay healthy and that we don't get into a situation like this. This was one of those poultry houses up in Lake Mills that had to go through a massive sort of reboot to their biosecurity to get them back into operation. So a lot of my work is spent in preventing issues rather than necessarily dealing with a lot of drama with sick cranes. I mean, how many of 120 birds can be sick at any one time? Hopefully not very many. So it's really, that has been our bread and butter in terms of our veterinary work. But we do have a full-service clinic that I run with a veterinary technician up at ICF, and we can take care of small things like this female crane named Bjorn, who broke a toe last summer and needed to have a small procedure done on that. Fortunately, we could get resident trainees as well as someone, an instructor from anesthesia, to come up to help us with this procedure, and everything has gone great. But a lot of the times, we also run into some very, very unusual situations that, okay, we need the stronger medicine approach, and we sort of activate that sort of preferred client status with the school. And this is going to revolve around not the little cute little chick whose name is Curry, but this is Chandani, the female Indian Saurus cranes. Indian Saurus cranes are the tallest flying bird in the world. Her mate actually is the old man who looks me in the eye. But she was really off this last year, and cranes will sometimes do really stupid things, like they love bright, shiny objects, and they like to pick at them, and they like to nibble and swallow them. Well, lo and behold, she wasn't doing very well, had very nonspecific signs like lethargy, and wasn't reacting to stimuli and her keepers. And finally we got around, she had a high white blood cell count, and we went around and finally took a radiograph, took an x-ray to see what might be wrong. And believe it or not, this bird had found a sort of a failing piece of wallboard in her pen and picked at it to the point where, and pulled out the nails quite surgically and swallowed them. And I think there's 7 of them in there. Now look at their distribution. Those are not in the bird's gizzard. They're not in the intestinal tract. We were like, where are they? And what kind of a danger does this present to her long-term health? Well, we really can only gain that kind of information by doing a little bit better of a construct through other types of advanced imaging. So we went ahead and brought her down and subjected her to a CT scan. And you can actually see those with these bright shiny fields right here and here, and I think this one right here. These are the stones inside her gizzard. And I'm just going to go through several of these, and if you look at where these points are, what we have is basically a series of pictures that show us that those foreign objects are thankfully not in any vital structure. We in particular were worried that one was near her oviduct. So when she goes to lay an egg, that would be a particular problem. In fact, once we sort of nursed her through this bout of ill health, she successfully laid an egg last year. And we just sort of said, look, to cut to cure is not in her future, because we're trying to remove these objects would cause far greater damage. And so like shrapnel in the body, perhaps it's just best to leave it alone. So we have a bird who's walking around up there with 7 nails in her belly, and it's just kind of an amazing feat. We deal with a lot of, because I've said we sort of set longevity records in a lot of species, we deal with a lot of chronic disease, a lot of arthritis. And so this is a picture of Bubba. I think Bubba was about 42 years of age when this picture was taken, and he has some pretty nasty arthritis in his tarsal joint, which is analogous to our ankle. But having been through a knee injury, I can really empathize with this bird. And you basically take the same approach by using some external supports, this hinged brace, to help him through this period of time after he had sort of re-injured this joint, and gets better. I also sort of like this picture because it's one time where it's a decent picture of me, and I feel like I'm giving the bird a helping hand, literally. So, but he went on to be with us for several more years after that. As I said, sometimes these birds can do rather stupid things, but they also, it's amazing, you know, when you're working with a species like the whooping crane that got to a low of 15 birds and has a relatively limited genetic diversity, you can't believe the accidents that befall these animals. And back in, I think it was 2005, we had a young chick who was just literally about to be released, like within 2 or 3 days. And a heavy iron ring that was supporting the netting that was on top of the pen that the bird was in somehow let loose, fell on the bird, and broke its wing. And so what happened is then that bird was brought down to Madison to actually have a very large orthopedic implant put in its humerus bone to help it to heal. But of course, though bird healing is, bone healing is very similar to mammals, we would expect this to be healed in 4 to 6 weeks. It's not going to coincide with being able to migrate. So that bird was was allowed actually back into his social group, which will help his demeanor and his behavioral management as that bird heals. But if you want to go visit this bird, you can see Torch at the Milwaukee County Zoo in their whooping crane exhibit. He did just fine, but he was sort of remanded to captivity because we don't have a way to bring these isolation reared birds into captivity and then re-release them. A very large part of what I do is focused on what we call reintroduction medicine. So we have sort of what I call the zoological practice for the captive flock and the birds that are productive, that are meeting population management goals, whether for captivity or for release in the wild with regards to whooping cranes. But then I have a very large slice that is focused on the medical management, the health management of the chicks that we are actually putting out to speed the recovery of the endangered whooping crane. I mentioned that old study that was done in the mid-1980s to work out a technique to prevent improper imprinting by cranes on people. And so you can see the handler of this young whooping crane chick is wearing a costume to sort of hide the human form beneath it. Because we do need to manage the health of these birds as they grow pretty intensely because they have a lot of problems. And so we have just like you would have a well child visit with your doctor for many years. For the first 2 months of life, we have the same kind of schedule for these very fast-growing chicks. They get to adult size within about 2 to 3 months. And so a lot is going on there and a lot can go wrong very quickly. And one very kind of interesting issue we had to deal with this last year was a sudden change in the timing of the work that we do to rear these birds. Normally, ICF is called upon amongst all of the institutions in North America that participate in crane rearing for reintroduction, and there are 3 of them, and one in Calgary and one outside of DC. We were asked instead of to rear chicks, instead of in June, in May. Well, if you know anything about the weather in Wisconsin in May, it's exceedingly variable and much different than a typical June. And what happened is we had a rash by July. We had a rash of rib fractures, broken ribs, in our group of chicks. In fact, we had 7 birds with 1 or more broken ribs. Bird ribs are normally quite strong structures, very rigid, but in a growing chick, they're fairly flexible. And because of how we handle the birds, we sort of nestle them in our hands and hold their legs so they don't scratch themselves. They can get a little top heavy. Maybe that puts a little bit of pressure on the chest, but we didn't think it was a handling issue. And what happened is that due to that early rearing, we think that they may have had some problems with bone strength. One, because of vitamin D, lowered vitamin D levels. We compared the 2017 chicks to a very good year that we had blood samples archived in our freezers and showed that this past year's chicks had slightly lowered vitamin D levels at 1 month of age, but that those corrected quite nicely by 2 to 3 months of age. And then also the thyroid that helps regulate calcium in the bloodstream, the parathyroid hormone, was elevated. In other words, the body's sort of crying out for a little bit more calcium into the system. And then we took a very deep look at the bird's diet that they were given in those first couple weeks. For a number of reasons, we had to use a diet that was slightly different than the zoo diet that we normally would use. Yes, it's AgriMaster poultry feed from Blaine's Farm and Fleet. And it didn't meet, lo and behold, junky food didn't meet the label, what they said on the label for its calcium phosphorus ratio, which should have been more like about 1.6. When we tested it, it was very low. It was about 1.1, and the problem is that's not particularly good for bone health and growth and development. You can see the crane diet that we normally have the birds on is at 1.45. And the reason we didn't have them on that diet, we had to go with this because we can't get this crumbled to a size that the chicks can handle. It comes in a little cylinder that they can begin to eat at about 2 weeks of age. So we needed to give them a diet, a little crumbly diet that they could ingest. But it was a little bit off. So we had this perfect storm of, and then here's my cue to say, well, the weather was pretty lousy in May. So the lousy weather, these chicks that can't thermoregulate very well have to be kept inside. Well, because our chick rearing is normally done later in the year, we don't make special arrangements or accommodations to incorporate UV lighting into our indoor housing. And we think those chicks were somewhat deficient in their exposure to UV light because we could only get them outside for short periods of time. And so there's a sort of perfect storm of, okay, I'm not making very much vitamin D, I'm not getting a very well-balanced calcium and phosphorus ratio in my diet, my vitamin D that I'm taking in isn't quite adequate, and thus we had a form of what's called metabolic bone disease, but fortunately, almost a subclinical or very, very mild form. The happy part of this story is that we got these birds through these episodes, and actually, if I'm not mistaken, all 7 of those birds were ultimately released, healed up and did fine. So it's kind of an unusual episode in our big commitment to helping ICF meet its goals in terms of helping the whooping crane recovery program and breeding the species. But in my time since I've been there, now this isn't to say that ICF, veterinary support for ICF weren't involved in our international programs or field work, but we've become more so in my time. We've been trying to sort of grow that side of the business, grow that side of the practice. And so I do a little bit more wildlife health in different places, and I wanted to tell you a little bit about that. It also is not surprising, perhaps, that it is focused on North America. It's what's kind of in our backyards. It's an extension of the work that we do with the captive whooping cranes, and that is working with the wild population of the whooping crane. So here we have this reintroduced population that we started here with in Wisconsin in 2001, but that is an extra experimental population. Really what I'd like you to focus on is this population that we refer to as the Aransas-Wood Buffalo population. This is the remnant wild migratory population that survived this genetic bottleneck in 1940 when there were only 15 of the entire species remaining. They were all in this population, and they're the population from which the captive flocks of ICF and sister organizations and all these reintroduced birds have sprung from. In fact, we think there were only about 4 to 6 matrilineal lines that actually survived the bottleneck. But the population winters at Aransas National Wildlife Refuge, an hour north of Corpus Christi. We'll talk maybe a little bit later about Hurricane Harvey and what it may or may not have done to that refuge. But the species breeds, and this wasn't known until the early 1950s, actually, where these birds went to breed in summer. And these were found by, I believe, foresters or firefighting outfits in Canada. And this was within the bounds of Wood Buffalo National Park, which straddles the boundary between Alberta and Northwest Territories at the 60th parallel. It's about a 2,500-mile migration. And this population has really recovered remarkably. The current number stands, I think Tom used a number in one of his advertisement pieces of the entire species numbers, I want to say somewhere between 650 and maybe 700 birds. But I want you to focus on that remnant wild population has gone from 15 in 1940 to between 350 and 400 birds today, as best we know. It's a pretty remarkable recovery. It's gone through a fairly robust, about 4% a year growth rate. They're beautiful birds to see on the landscape. It's North America's tallest flying bird. Impressive wingspan. These are birds stand about 5.5 feet tall, but remarkably don't weigh a whole lot. They're about 5 to 6 kilograms, maybe 12 to 14 pounds. And our work has really focused on a willingness by the Canadian Wildlife Service and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to now dive a little bit deeper into where these birds are on the landscape, what kinds of habitat do they use, and learn more sort of fine-scale spatial information about their migration routes and their local use of breeding and wintering habitat. So beginning in 2009, we had a first phase of marking of this species for the first time in probably about 20 years. And we focused on these remnant sort of concentrations of the population in a couple of different watersheds in the north part of Wood Buffalo National Park. So this black line is the north-central sort of border of Wood Buffalo National Park. Here's the NWT Alberta border. Fort Smith, Northwest Territories, is located about right there where my pointer is. And that's where we fly out from. And so what we're making use of are helicopter surveys and nesting surveys that the Canadian Wildlife Service does every May to understand what the distribution, the number and distribution is of the whooping crane nesting effort. They count how many birds are sitting still on a nest, and it's pretty easy to see a white dot on a very non-white landscape. And then we know if we come back to that site in 2 months, in about 40 to 50% of the time, we might find a chick with those parents. But that territory has to be reached by air, and by and especially if we're going to get on the ground, by helicopter, because it's essentially an inaccessible wilderness. And so we stage out of Fort Smith, the small airport there, fly over the Great Slave River, and get to the whooping crane nesting grounds. And that's probably about the best shot I can give you from this last year, which is just this amazing sort of boreal forest, wetland system with these large networks of ponds with only just small ridges of dry land between these wet areas. And this is essentially what we're looking for. We're looking for a pair of adult cranes with one or more brown juveniles. And these juveniles at this age actually can't quite fly. They're probably about 2 months of age. So they're just growing their primary feathers, and they'll fledge probably in about 2 to 3 weeks after this one. This is right around August 1st. If we actually find a family group with twins, we take a pass on them. But in order to do the marking, what we wanted to do was to get singles. So we call the chicks colts. So if we found a family group with one colt, then we would go in and we would mark that bird and put a satellite telemetry tag on them. And then one of the reasons I was there was, well, one, just to play the role of a veterinarian in case there was some form of an accident. But we believed in our technique. That saying, we were following the procedures that Canadian Wildlife Service used in the late 80s to do a very small project by similar means. But the hope was that we could add a little bit of science value to what we were getting out of that, to learn a little bit more about this species in the wild, and to do this both in Canada and in Texas. So I thought with this next video you'd sort of see exactly how this happens and how you actually get into this. I didn't think I would have to be doing all this physical training in my advanced years for this kind of work, but it sure has been a lot of fun. So this is shortly after we left Fort Smith Airport over the Slave River. We spotted a family group, and now it becomes a race against time. This is the woman in front of me is Valerie from the Calgary Zoo. She's wearing a pink hat.
He's
And what we're doing is we're sort of keying in on the helicopter there. You see it looks like a fly in the upper part of the video there. The helicopter positions itself back behind the family group and gives us something to sight in on because we're not going to see the birds on the ground. And their natural inclination is once the parents see us, the parents will alarm call and flush, and then the baby will hunker down and just sort of hide under the trees or any available vegetation. And so we have 12 minutes because there's no real pursuit in this capture. We want to get our hands on, but we don't want to disturb them for any longer than we have to, so we have 12 minutes to get to the chick. And then once we have our hands on the chick, our goal is about 15 to 20 minutes of working time to get our jobs done. So here we're weighing the animal. We've given it a health check. We've attached a telemetry device, which I'll show you. And then we release the chick back into the wetland. And I've now been through 78 of these events. And in every case, we have a very, very high degree of confidence that they have reunited with their parents. The parents don't go very far. They're not right next to us by any means, but they don't go far. And they reunite very, very fast. And so, again, our job is to take biological samples from these birds, take measurements. I'm actually doing a study looking at these birds' stress responses, acute stress response. So we try to take our blood sample very quickly after we lay hands on them, and then we take a second sample 12 minutes later to look at how the incline of that stress response may vary depending on various conditions. And we'll compare that to values we get from adults at a later point. If there's a minor injury, again, you've got a veterinarian embedded in your field team to help take care of that. We attach now, we're using actually a newer generation of telemetry tag. This is what's called a GSM tag, or it's basically a cellular device. And so as soon as this bird reaches a cell phone tower at the right moment, it will actually get a ping, it will make contact and dump all of its spatial data into our network basically via cell phone. And so you can imagine if we're doing this with several animals, you're going to get both individual histories, but then you'll get this snapshot of the population in much more detail. So this is the actual history of that chick that we just looked at and their migration this past fall. In fact, if you look at if you could track the dates there, you'd actually see the bird was only flying for not even a week to make that entire 2,500 mile distance. They typically in fall will stage in central Saskatchewan and feed in agricultural fields, so they spent a month in Saskatchewan before they pushed on south. And this is the range of stopover sites that were used by birds that we marked with these devices between 2009 and 2014. And the interesting thing here, I think, is that the vast, vast majority of these sites that these birds stop at during their migration are on private land. And there are real conservation challenges on those private lands. We think that we've got enough protected public lands and landscapes that are good for cranes available to them, but it turns out that they use quite a bit more habitat than we ever imagined previously. And that's the kind of thing that was pulled together by the USGS, Fish and Wildlife Service, and Canadian Wildlife Service through this study. But as I said, we tried to add sort of additional biological value by doing a number of other studies of the cranes themselves and looking at their parasite communities, looking at some of their clinical pathology, their blood protein measures, some of behavioral measures and things like that. Things that might help us as, if nothing else, baseline data, so if this species gets into trouble in the future, we've got a reference point that we can come back to. But now we're into the second phase of this project, and that's what I wanted to sort of finish up with on the whooping crane side of things quickly, and that is because Canadian Wildlife Service and Fish and Wildlife Service are becoming increasingly concerned about oil and gas development throughout this bird's migration range and wintering range in particular. Wood Buffalo National Park is pretty unlikely to be developed in a significant way. But there could be ramifications to the hydrology and contaminants if the oil sands region in northern Alberta sort of expands significantly beyond where it is just south of the park. But through that initial telemetry phase, we found out that birds stopped in the oil sands region, the mineable area, and they even overnighted on tailings ponds. And there's a lot of concern about this. So if you look at the inset map here to the right, this is the mineable area, sort of the designated region within which oil sands mining can occur. Here's the southern border of Wood Buffalo National Park. The nesting grounds are probably about right here, just off the figure. So this bird landed in a tailings pond with its family, or with its parents, overnight. Probably in and of itself, not the largest potential for any kind of toxic exposure, but you could imagine some birds over repeated stopovers may pick up or be at risk of something that is. And so this is of concern for them. And then the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is also a bit concerned about oil and gas development in and around the National Wildlife Refuge in Texas. The Aransas National Wildlife Refuge was formed actually such that the United States government owns the surface rights, but not the mineral rights. And so if you look at all these red dots right here, this is the mainland portion of the refuge known as the Blackjack Peninsula. There's all sorts of oil and gas wells all over the peninsula. You see several throughout the bay systems here as well. Also, this is a major shipping channel. I think here some of you can sort of get a feel that there's almost a line here and certainly right here. This is the Gulf Intercoastal Waterway. This is as busy as the Mississippi. And this completely bisects the National Wildlife Refuge. So there's a ton of barge traffic there. So the possibility of a spill is ever present. This is a new oil well that was put in the last year. Looks relatively benign until you sort of look at this and say, why did they need all of this space for what ultimately is a fairly small installation? Well, this entire pad was full of drilling gear when they first drilled this well. And they were convinced to initiate their drilling operations in the uplands away from the crane marshes and drill it at an angle. And so this is what we're encountering. There are two new facilities like this that are much closer to the crane marshes than anything else previously. So there was motivation to renew this marking study this year. And so just a little over a week ago, I got back from the Aransas Refuge where we successfully captured 7 birds and put these new transmitters on them. And so I think in the promotional material I said, how do you capture a crane in a salt marsh? Well, here you go. This is kind of the view into the crane's habitat here with these various marsh plants just up from the bay ecosystem. You've got extensive salt flats or sand flats there between these small hummocks of wetland vegetation. We make use, we look for crane sign. It's actually pretty, not too hard to tell the difference between, they share some of this habitat with sandhill cranes, and whooping crane footprints look pretty different than sandhills. They spread their toes a little bit more. I've become an expert at reading poop. This is, you can tell the whooping crane scat pretty easily because they feast on Carolina wolfberries when they first reach Texas. And so that's all those tomato-like seeds getting splatted out in the scat of the bird. So we've got footprints. We've got scat. That means they're using that area as kind of a highway. We look for a little bit of raised area where we can hide a game feeder. We attract them in with something they might like if they're in the area, and that's corn. Believe you me, wild whooping cranes love to come to feeders, just like our small songbirds in your backyard. And so it's not too hard to get them to come in for a free meal. But sometimes you have to wait and wait. I'm the third guy on the capture crew, so I get relegated to a quarter mile away, and I'm on a radio listening for when we actually go live, and we can predict that a bird will be in the area. Sometimes I get to sit in a turkey blind for the better part of 8 hours. That's not real pleasant with a couple of other guys who are 6'2" and 6'4". Gets kind of crowded. We have to brush these in very well and hide them, and then hopefully we get a bird coming into that little hole with a remotely triggered snare trap. And that looks like this. It's a very safe device that took actually years of R&D. And that is, and lots of swearing and lots of trial and error. And we said if it works on us and it doesn't hurt us, it won't hurt the cranes. And yeah, we actually use a monofilament snare line that is activated with a shock cord that pulls it tight quickly around the bird's leg. And you send the person out who's the designated handler in this place, so this is a PhD running after a crane, Dr. Felipe Ramirez. And then you have to really know what to do when the bird turns on you. And so that's always a bit of a terrifying moment because we all have scars. I got a beautiful kissing wound from a bird this last trip. But I kind of like this picture because this has happened a few times where we catch birds right at sunrise. This is Dr. Brad Strobel. He's the refuge biologist at Necedah National Wildlife Refuge holding the bird, and David Brandt, a USGS employee who's a field biologist and a master trapper extraordinaire. These are beautiful animals. They are tough as nails. They're not quite like the birds I work with at ICF, who are a little bit wimpy. They've adapted to captivity. Some of them are real headaches, but boy, these birds want to just kill you. I mean, that's the thing. Well, think about it. They're in full-on fight or flight mode, right? So we employ the same standard with these animals that we do with those younger chicks. We want to keep the stress on these animals as brief as possible and let them go on their way. And again, we've sort of averaged about 15 to 20 minutes worth of work. And you can see we've attached the telemetry device to the leg of that bird. And this is the kind of data that we get. So this is the bird that Brad was holding 2 slides ago. She was captured, I think, right here. And she got the hell out of there, and this was her first flight down to here. She went across the intercoastal waterway, kind of hung out, recouped, and then came back to her territory and hooked up with her mate and chick. And then, interestingly, within a day, that family decided to move. Now, whether that was due to us, we're not exactly sure because we've seen other pairs do this. But there used to be the dogma was that birds would have, especially pairs, family groups would have very tight fidelity to a winter territory. And that's what this male is kind of showing you. You know, they make small forays for various resources, maybe sometimes up into the uplands, but they pretty much stick close to their wintering territories. We're going to learn a lot more from this data because we're taking a point on these birds every 30 minutes as opposed to every 6 hours. And so you can make much better inferences about resource use and whatnot. And again, the whole idea is to gain better knowledge of the use of the habitat of these species so that we can do a better job protecting the landscape while this species recovers. And they're looking at some big challenges with sea level rise and changes in coastal habitat and coastal development in Texas. So I wanted to end up tonight talking to you a little bit about some of the work that I've also been able to do internationally, which has been quite wonderful over the last few years. I used to wonder, actually, in the first 5 years of my employment with ICF, what the I stood for. Because look, everything I told you happened in Wisconsin or Texas. But yeah, the International Crane Foundation, again, we want, instead of just being a consultant by email, we wanted to support our global programs in more meaningful ways when possible, and support the people who are helping us do that work in those places. And that, I think, is what has been most rewarding for me. Is these are going to be two stories sort of talking about people we've worked with. This is Dr. Olivier Sangamana. Olivier is a veterinarian. Actually, he was sort of discovered, in a sense, by one of my classmates, Dr. Jan Raymer, who worked with the organization Gorilla Doctors, which is now administered by UC Davis. But they provide veterinary services to the mountain gorillas in the Virunga Volcanoes region in Rwanda and Uganda and Congo. And Olivier was a gorilla doctor. But Olivier had an idea about protecting the cranes of his country. And there is just one species of crane in small Rwanda, and that is the gray-crowned crane. Species you probably see quite often, either on television or in zoos. And he won an award from Rolex Watches, has a Young Laureate Award, kind of a mini MacArthur Genius Award. He got government support to take on the issue of domestic trade in these animals. And it's very interesting. Everybody thinks of wildlife trade and thinks of trafficking going to the Middle East or to China or nefarious, organizations in Europe or the US. But this was actually, the crown crane is a status symbol in this part of the world. And so wealthy people and hoteliers like to have a crane in their garden to show off. And so birds are sort of poached out of the wild and brought in and are kind of held as domestic pets. They're treated all right. Actually, some people take great pride in their treatment of their cranes, but they don't do well. They don't breed. Some birds are brutalized to keep them flightless. It's a pretty depressing situation. And we knew that in East Africa, the gray crown crane population was really plummeting. And actually, in the time I've worked for ICF, since 2000, this species has been listed as endangered on the IUCN Red List. And so Olivier wanted to take on this issue of trade in his country, and first and foremost by working with the government to run a registration program where people who have these birds, and they're holding them privately, register them, and there's kind of an amnesty there. They're not going to be prosecuted, they're not going to be fined. But those birds are going to be evaluated and then possibly re-released in the wild. And that's where his veterinary side comes in, and his contact with me is I helped with sort of help capacity building in his team of himself and a couple of veterinarians that have worked with him. Because what they want to do is his work with gorilla doctors, if nothing else, showed him the value of biosecurity and the whole idea that humans and animals sometimes can have just devastating sort of consequences on one another in terms of disease transfer. And so what we did is they would confiscate animals then ultimately from homes and bring them into quarantine in Kigali, in the capital city, place them in quarantine for 30 to 60 days, health check them, make sure we're not going to transfer any disease into the wild, and then we would re-release these birds in Akagera National Park in the eastern part of the country. Again, to bring the numbers of the cranes up in the country. There's only one number I want you to remember is 500 birds was the estimate for the entire country of Rwanda in the wild. Gray-crowned cranes in the wild at the start of this project. And so we work with his team basically to teach them principles of avian medicine, conservation and such. Here I'm working with Deo Ragazi, who actually just wrote me today, which was really great. Deo's a wonderful man, a great veterinarian, very dedicated to what he's doing with the cranes, and now actually wants to do a scientific research project, and sent me a spreadsheet of data and was like, here, I need you to help me with this. And here we're working on an injured bird, actually at Akagera Park, trying to treat an animal with an inflamed foot. But this last February, or February 2017, I had the pleasure to run a 3-week training workshop for 10 veterinarians and a couple of veterinary students on sort of principles of avian medicine to help give Olivier and Deo additional human resources, people who can really help them get their job done to rehabilitate the species in this big project. We also had Ann Lacey from ICF in the middle there come with me for a couple of weeks, and we worked on field techniques that we can use with the cranes. And this is an interesting sort of redeployment of a traditional Indian and Pakistani crane hunting technique, these snare lines. And in fact, we actually used this same technique with whooping cranes 2 weeks ago at the Aransas Refuge, where you have a line of snares and the birds sort of walk through it and they get a foot stuck and they're looking around and they don't know what's going on. By then you lay hands on them and restrain them. In this way we can help treat any birds with problems, or if other kinds of interventions need to happen, but in a safe way, we can do that. Because you can't dart a crane. You gotta use other kinds of means. But we basically were helping to teach his team, Olivier's team, in their safe use. So in all, Olivier and his team have registered 262 cranes in the capital region alone. Remember the number I gave you before. We thought there were 500 left in the wild. That's a huge proportion of the population that has been poached and is in captivity. And Lord knows how many birds were lost, along the way to make that happen. And out of that 262 number, 196 birds have been released in the wild in Akagera. And again, the idea is to supplement. One, it's really to make a good thing happen out of a pretty terrible situation. And so this is much less a conservation biology or population recovery program as it is an anti-trade, live bird trade program. But we have an opportunity to potentially supplement the population in this savanna park in the eastern part of Rwanda with these cranes as well, which I think is a great thing, and hopefully reverse a declining trend for this species in Central Africa. One last project I wanted to tell you about quick involves Whitenaped cranes and kind of a remote relationship that I've got with a conservation outfit in Mongolia. This is the distribution of Whitenaped cranes. This is a vulnerable species in East Asia with breeding populations in Mongolia and northern China and far eastern Russia. And they winter predominantly in two or three places. At Poyang Lake, a large inland freshwater lake system, very similar to the Great Lakes almost, in southern China. And then also in the DMZ in the Koreas, as well as at a place called Izumi in Japan. And so this species we know is in a bit of decline, but seems to have a stronghold in eastern Mongolia. And we've worked with Dr. Nimba Batbayar from the Mongolia Wildlife Science and Conservation Center in Ulaanbaatar. We're trying to turn this raptor biologist into a craniac. He seems to really like cranes a lot, so we're kind of, working on him quite a bit. We've been able to find funding actually from the U.S. Forest Service to their international programs to help with rangeland conservation, which is really kind of the biggest issue with regards to wetland conservation and what is a fairly dry ecosystem. And what our small project is doing is trying to make use of some non-invasively acquired samples from the cranes to tell us a little bit about their potential exposures to various contaminants. And so we're using eggshells from hatchings and feathers that are shed from the adults onto nest platforms like this, or that are taken from live chicks, because Nimba and his team are banding the resulting chicks at about 2 days of age, right around August 1st, just like the whooping cranes, and they're able to pluck a feather or two from those birds harmlessly. And we can test those for a variety of persistent organic pollutants, as well as heavy metals. And so one of the things that we have done is worked with his team to conduct a pilot project where they're already monitoring this production of this endangered species, already charting these nesting sites. Now we're just asking them to collect materials off of this website, or this nesting site, and then get them analyzed to inform us a little bit on an issue that we have very little information on cranes from, because cranes are hard to grab. As you've sort of seen from my work with whooping cranes, it's really hard to understand what kind of exposure they have on a landscape to things like persistent organics or heavy metals, for that matter. So I always like to end with something cute. This is a pretty extraordinary find. Now this means that, yeah, that second egg may hatch out in another day or two. But I'm sure they went ahead and took the eggshell off of that nest site for testing. But I just wanted to use those few stories as sort of illustrations of this kind of collaborative partnership between the veterinary school in particular, although the relationship between ICF and the university cuts across many, many departments actually. But for my world in veterinary medicine, it's been a really interesting journey to watch, again, over about this 35-year period. And we're really hopeful that these just fantastic individuals, these young veterinarians who we're working with, can continue this tradition into the future. So thank you very much for your time. So I'd be happy to take any questions if you have them. Yeah.
What kind of differences do you see in the biosamples you collect from the wild and the captive whooping cranes? One of our big goals was to look for their exposure to infectious diseases that could be real problematic for their population. And I have to admit, it's a fairly biased sample. We're dropping in on the birds who are out there and probably doing well. But they are remarkably robust. Some of their blood work looks like, I would just attribute it to dietary differences. And there are no, at this time, thankfully, any real warning signals, which is, I think, kind of, I didn't really go into this expecting to find a lot of problems. But what it's done is it's given us an extremely rich data set. One, we've been able to use the blood samples for genetic analysis to, again, do more contemporary genomic work. But just from kind of a health point of view, it's really kind of given us the baseline now that we never had before, that if there are issues for this species in the future, we have something to compare it to that we would tend to think is normal and reflective of a healthy growing population, because that's what's happening right at this time. Yeah.
Is predation a driver of mortality in the wild cranes, and if so, what are the predators?
Absolutely. The majority of mortality is driven by predation. In southern states, bobcat are pretty common as predators. Coyotes can take cranes. Again, the stealth predators like a bobcat would be probably more successful. There are cases of golden eagles and bald eagles taking young cranes or sandhill cranes, but I don't think we know of that from adult whooping cranes. We see evidence of wolves, of course, in Wood Buffalo Park, but again, the features on the landscape that protect cranes, they go to sleep at night, they roost in shallow water, about 12 to 18 inches. You're not going to get something being able to sneak up on them typically in that situation. So if there's birds with something wrong with them, it's usually a terrestrial predator who would be responsible. Yeah?
So I'm not sure if the whooping cranes that go from Texas to Canada, were any of those from the Wisconsin project?
No, no. So that is all natural growth of this remnant wild free-ranging population. Again, that's grown about 4% a year for several decades now, and we think they're about 350 to 400. It's interesting to note, so that's fantastic gains, but depending on which criteria are used by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, this species cannot be downlisted from endangered to threatened until there are nearly 1,000 cranes. So if the reintroduced populations are not included in that criterion, you have to have 1,000 cranes. So it's going to take, well, hopefully not, but probably beyond my lifetime to get to that number. It's going to take a long time.
So what was the key for them to come back from 60?
Leaving them alone, it seems. You know, it was really that the unintended consequence almost of protection of the Aransas Refuge and Wood Buffalo National Park, which essentially were not created for them. They were for other resources. And I think this chain of stopover protected areas in the Central Plains probably also had a lot to do with it. And so if you look at the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and other pieces of legislation that have regulated waterfowl hunting and the take of non-game animals, I'm sure that combined with some serious conservation steps of creating protected areas has really helped the species. Now, the cranes are pushing the boundaries of those protected areas, like in the south, and that is the key. How do you accommodate 1,000 birds on that landscape? Really tough, because I don't care about Hurricane Harvey. There are a lot of people down there, and they're moving right back in. They're rebuilding. Some people are getting the heck out, but there's a lot of development pressure. And then, of course, with predicted models of sea level rise in the Gulf, wow, they're going to face challenges in the next 100 years for sure. Yeah.
What effects have the hurricanes in Texas and Florida had on the cranes?
Well, it's interesting. I should have left it in after this last slide. I did have a picture that a colleague sent me from Florida. I don't know, help me. Somebody give me a name of a hurricane that came through a decade ago. And so, it was Andrew, I think it was. Yeah. Anyway, so there was a reintroduced population in Florida, or there are a few birds still out there. And that project kind of failed. But there's a great picture that shows these massive tall pines all snapped off like toothpicks. And there's a couple of cranes hanging out right in front of that entire stand, just like, oh, we're good. What they do is they either hunker down or they kind of get out of the way. And we don't think that I'd be amazed if we actually had a storm event and the species was literally lost at this point. That would be hard to fathom, that we could lose up to 400 cranes in a single event, even a disease outbreak. But their resiliency is improved through that. The probability of taking all of them is pretty low. So yes, you might have a few mortalities, but I doubt you would have sort of catastrophic loss. The fortunate thing about Harvey is that it was also a significant rain event. And so there was a somewhat limited storm surge, so there was saltwater intrusion into the crane marshes. So these are all, it's an estuary system. So it's salt marsh, basically protected by a barrier island. This is not on the coast of the Gulf. So these are so the barrier island helped buffer that a bit. But there was also a significant rain event that tended to wash a lot of that salt water away. There were some intrusions, obviously, but did the whole ecosystem, did it collapse? No. I guess I would liken it to the Yellowstone fires. Looks kind of potentially bad, but the production has been fantastic in the marsh so far this season.
With the crane population, it was 15 birds.
Right.
That seems like a limited genetic pool.
Yep.
How is that going to come out when you reach 1,000, it's still going to be the same genetic pool, right?
Well, we don't know. I mean, to the best of our ability, we have completely replicated by the way the captive flocks were formed. Was cranes typically lay 2 eggs, but they usually pull off 1 chick to fledging. So there's kind of an extra egg there. In the 70s and 80s, Canadian Wildlife Service allowed collection of that second egg, and that's how these breeding centers kind of established. What's interesting is that the genetics that are in the current captive flock really do mirror what is in the wild. They are essentially the same. So we haven't lost anything there. And we can outbreed and selectively breed birds in captivities to maximize genetic diversity. And so that's kind of the strategy that we follow. The predicted models, it's very interesting. You know, I think classically you'd think that they would lose diversity over time and that the species may be in trouble. But it's not panning out that way. We don't see symptoms of inbreeding and other defects in captivity even. They were predicted to have lost about 1/3 of their genetic diversity through the bottleneck. So I'm sure there are more brilliant genetic minds in this audience right now, but that's really hard for me to explain based on my knowledge of population genetics. So it's a challenge going forward, no doubt. Yeah, in the back.
Why can't you dart cranes? Why do you have to stand?
They don't have enough muscle mass. They don't have big butts to blow dart. You inject things in their muscle, actually in their breast muscle, like you would a chicken. But these guys are pretty lean, and so the velocity of the projectiles would cause way too much damage. So they can't take a dart. So you can do other kinds of tricky things, like you can lace bait with an orally absorbed anesthetic, but then you have to wait 12 to 24 hours for them to recover. So we don't have anything we can give them, knock them out, and then safely bring them up and say, go fly away. You really need a lot more recovery time, and so the typical kind of anesthesia you would do with mammals in the field is just really not very practicable. So you go back to physical methods, and you just be being sure it's safe and not traumatic.
Wasn't ICF establishing a migratory flock in Louisiana?
We participate in a project that is trying to establish a non-migratory flock in this Cajun prairies of southwest Louisiana. Louisiana is a really interesting little sidelight because it was the last place that breeding bird was observed in the United States. And that was in, I think, 1951. It was early 50s. I have an ICF colleague here tonight. And that race, or that subpopulation, died out. So we don't know. But the Cajun Prairie, it's the wetland resources in southwestern Louisiana are amazing. Supports an incredible diversity of water birds. It's crawfish and rice agriculture. So the habitat is there. We think it can support, it supports sandhill cranes. We think it can support whooping cranes. And it was the last place we saw actual non-migratory breeding whooping cranes in the continental United States. So since 2010, although the releases happened in 2011, we've been participating in releases there, but we actually have very little to do with the field work. We just provide the birds. All those guys with the rib fractures, they ended up down there. So, yeah. Yeah?
What's the operational life of
the satellite and the cell trackers are kind of dependent on, they're completely dependent on the battery life, so those solar panels got to do their job, and they're listed as 3 to 5 years.
So it's a solar recharging battery?
It's a solar recharging battery, yeah. And so it's collecting a GPS point every 30 minutes and storing that data. and it will only offload all of that data the next time it activates and happens to be in range of a cell tower. They made a mistake when they first programmed it that it would only come on for, I think it was 30 seconds or a minute at one point in the day, which means you had to have the bird up and flying and in range of a cell tower at that very moment. It's like you could go a year without getting any information. It's not a virtual tracking scheme. It's you have to rely on the technology working, and then when the animal gets close enough and at the right time, it will offload potentially months of data. And so the idea is that we're going to get incredibly fine-scale information about habitat use up and down the flyway. And for a study that's looking at potential, how are these birds imaging and what are they searching for and why would they come down in a tailings pond versus something that's more natural, we can begin to get clues as to what aspects they're keying in on. And then can we work with industry to make those places less attractive for cranes?
Have you snared any birds that already had the tracker on it?
Yes, actually we did this 2 weeks ago. We actually did recapture a bird that we banded in 2014. So that transmitter had gone offline, I think, maybe a year ago. And so we got a new one because everything looked great. But no, the plan is not, these are permanent marks. So that is, and so we have to be sure that they're not going to impede the bird's mobility or breeding. And we don't really have a strong signal that way at all right now. And as a matter of fact, on the newest device, we have 3 birds at ICF in our captive flock wearing them right now for a 6-month trial to see is there any risk to these birds wearing this. So we're trying to give some feedback to the company on that. Yeah?
Even if Aransas stays stable environmentally, are we pushing the carrying capacity there?
Well, that's just it. They're going to need more play. They're going to need more space.
Are we near that?
Oh shoot. Do you remember the estimated number?
The current number right now?
No. Of that Aransas could possibly hold. I want to say well, we're getting there. Let's put it this way. We have many, many more observations in the 2010s. So in the last few years, outside of the bounds of the refuge, because under duress, drought is the biggest driver for them to have to go look for sources of fresh water. These birds don't have an active salt excreting mechanism, and they live in a salt marsh. And so they have to search when the salinities in the bay or in the marshes get above 17 parts per thousand, they have to move and find fresh water to drink on a daily basis. And so that means they're going off refuge sometimes if they have to. And so in the last drought in 2011, 12, 13, there were reports of birds kind of all over the place, places you wouldn't expect them to be. They're much more active now that they're infilling. The territories are kind of contracting. They're sort of filling in all the prime real estate. And then now younger birds, presumably, are kind of pushing the boundaries. Yeah.
What do you look for in the blood that indicates the bird is at stress?
So do you know cortisol? So the avian equivalent is corticosterone. So we're essentially looking for a slightly different hormone. We have done projects with cranes at ICF with corticosterone for close to 20 years now. We can look for it in stool, but this is the first time we've actually done it with blood, just because, once you restrain an animal, they're going to have a stress response. That baseline level is going to go up. You may not capture it. For me, that is not necessarily the essence. It's how primed is the adrenal gland to secreting corticosterone into the bloodstream. And chronic stress will change the dynamics, basically, of that acute stress response. So instead of looking at sort of baseline levels, how are things going, what were you subjected to in the last 12 to 24 hours, it's how are you going to respond to this immediate fight or flight, kind of situation.
And then we look and see, what's the kind of variation across the population? What is the variation with regards to other disturbance factors on their landscape? Like for the adult birds in Texas, it's oil and gas. Now, it's going to be a big ask to see how we can actually compare that. It'll be just highly correlative, not causal, but there's a lot of questions. How does all this add up, either for the benefit or the detriment of the birds? We're just trying to get a feel for that.
For 2018, does the breeding have to happen in May again, or go back to June?
Oh, for our captive breeding? Well, one of Donald Trump's budget item cuts happened to be our sister organization in Patuxent, Maryland. The place where the original captive flock of whooping cranes was established in the 1960s, Patuxent. So that's where George W. Bush used to ride his mountain bike for exercise. The Patuxent Wildlife Research Center is losing their crane program. They cut it to save $1.5 million a year. Without really solid evidence that now is the best time to make that move. We all realize if we do our job right, we'll be out of business in that regard. So I want to see that day, but not in this fashion. So the flock is being redistributed. I think we're going to be rearing chicks in May, and we've already investigated, our management, our diet, and indoor lighting options for 2018. And we're hoping for fair weather. But man, when you get those really nasty spring storms that come in out of the east, bad news. Cranes don't like them. Thanks very much. Appreciate it.